Blurred memory by Hydesgrain. Don't scare her like that, Dahlia said, staring daggers at him. However, Jason could only shrug his shoulders, thinking that his words were certainly true. If the Drake family were to find out that they lived here, he might personally come over and torture everyone who was connected to them, not because Shane killed old Drake, but more likely because of the Ice Dragon mother he sent over. In the end, the Ice Dragon killed the Drake clan's major combat force, which forced the Patriarch to act accordingly to not lose out to the other kingdoms. Unfortunately, Shane unintentionally dragged innocent prodigies from Asterix Island in the dispute because the Drake family patriarch forcefully subdued them to replace his clan's lost combat power. He might have to nurture most youths, but with enough time, the Drake family would come out stronger than ever before, which worried Jason. Every action caused a certain reaction, and in his opinion, Shane didn't seem to bother thinking about the big picture because he was either worried about Jason being subdued or something similar to that. However, through this, Jason felt somewhat guilty, and he would definitely try his best to fix this mess in the future. Nevertheless, to make something like that even possible, he would have to become stronger than the Drake family patriarch, who had most likely a deal with foreign races, allowing him to completely transmute his mana. Adding more unknown trumps, Jason estimated that he had to become much stronger than a normal sovereign rank with 3 solidified prismarine crystals within his mana core. Comparing it to the revamped cultivation system he obtained from the Terra manuals, Jason would have to leave the mortal stage, break into the lick stage, and once his whole mana core was liquefied, he could start creating his first solidified prismarine crystal to enter the Prisma stage. After that, it would be the best solution if he was able to create 4 solidified prismarine crystals before he might be able to face whole big clans without the need to fear being pursued like Shane and Dahlia, because he was strong enough to retaliate. Jason didn't even want to think how long it might take for him to enter the Prisma stage under his current circumstances, because his mana core rank was several times larger than a normal expert rank thanks to his high soul world amplification that seemed to be a blessing and a curse at the same time. His high soul world amplification allowed him to become much stronger than others, but at the same time prevented him from breakthrough in his mana core rank. This would only mean that he had to rely on his soulbond's strength, which was nothing bad per se. However, once he received a curse or would be forced to enter a state where he was under a similar condition, which might temporarily decrease or completely nullify his soul world amplification, he would be powerless. Furthermore, his vessel would break once his soulbonds became too strong for him to handle their soul world amplified strength. Sighing deeply, Jason didn't know what Dahlia was exactly thinking to throw an outsider inside the wolf den, but who was he to complain? As long as Emily remained silent, nothing would happen, and revolting against Dahlia was probably the worst he could do. Her outer appearance was quiet, but Jason knew that she could become furious, which was not something he would ever want to see again. With that in mind, he couldn't but tease. "Okay, Master, do as you wish, but please remain level-headed." Turning around to Shane, he asked, "I don't want to drag everything on longer. Can you bring me to the abandoned lands and take me back on Sunday evening?" Shane was also uncomfortable with Dahlia's sudden change in behavior, but there was even less he could do against his wife because he knew her better than anyone else. Once she decided on doing something, there was nothing in the world holding her back except death, which brought back painful memories that included many betrayals and deaths. He didn't want to think about that anymore and shook his head before he looked at Jason, only to nod his head. Opening a spatial portal behind him, Shane just said, "The area I picked should be good for you to forge if you have the desire to do so. There shouldn't be many strong beasts around there. Your 2 clingy soul bonds should be more than enough to fend them off and gain some combat experience. Right now they can't even be considered proper peak unblemished ranked beasts because of the shallow combat experience. Probably even mid unblemished beasts with superior combat experience and a good affinity proficiency could kill them." Jason smiled lightly, thanking his master before he took one last glance at Emily, only to say with a bright smile, "Even if you're overwhelmed right now, don't forget that you have to work from Monday on. Furthermore, Read the handbooks I gave you. Jumping through the spatial portal with the Viridi Starstream dagger set in his hands, Artemis flew after him while Scorpio required some time to turn around without destroying everything in the living room before he also rushed towards the spatial portal. Once the three vanished, the whole living room seemed to enlarge several times as Scorpio, who used up the most space, was not there anymore, and Shane could only sigh deeply. What a troublemaker, he can't even control his soul bonds. Why are they even so indigent? Averting his attention to Dahlia, who was talking to Emily, completely ignoring that Jason disappeared in his words, Shane couldn't help but feel lost in his own home as a thought appeared in his mind. Should I have just followed Jason? The abandoned lands are probably more interesting and less hurting than being ignored in my own home. Pondering what he should do, Shane opened a holographic screen on his quantum bracelet, and at the same time he took out the book about all curses in order to find a suitable curse to lower Jason's soul world amplification without touching anything else. Hours passed and Emily finally calmed down, only to fall asleep in the guest room, when Shane suddenly jumped up from the chair which Dahlia, who was seated next to him, noticed. What is it, Shane? Did you find something? Dahlia knew what Shane was searching for, and seeing that he jumped up from his chair had to mean something good. However, seeing the complicated expression on his face didn't seem to mean anything good. Is it something bad? She asked, waiting for an answer, only for Shane to sit down with a sigh. Do you remember something about the Mythic Garden? The name is written here and I'm sure that I was there already, but I can't seem to remember. Everything about it feels blurry. Almost as if something prevents me from remembering. When Dahlia heard the name, Mythic Garden, she remembers something about it, but it was weird and she felt exactly the same like Shane. I also recall something, but it's only a faint memory. Wasn't it considered a sacred place? But why? Holding his head with both hands, Shane tried everything to clear his memories because of the words written inside the book that said, Mythic Garden, Land of the Blessed and Cursed. Chapter 312, Abandoned Lands by Hydesgrain. Emerging outside the spatial portal, Jason was enveloped in a reeking stench that tried to forcefully infiltrate him, within a matter of seconds. Manifesting the black origin flame around his face, he could breathe freely without any disturbance, and the reeking stench slowly dissipated. Looking around, there was a huge mountain on Jason's left while the right side was a large plain. Starting to look around, he couldn't help but smile as he said, These are the abandoned lands on Terebrine. The abandoned lands were places humanity gave up to construct cities on, or even nearby. As for the reason, it was pretty simple. The surrounding environment released a reeking, poisonous stench that harmed humans greatly as long as they didn't prepare anything to protect themselves from it. Jason, for example, could just filter the air with his black origin flame, but doing something similar with millions of people in a single city was not feasible and would be expensive, nullifying possible profits almost immediately. There might be a few groups of hunters around the abandoned lands that spanned over the western part of Terebrine, however, it would be rare to encounter anyone. This was not only because Shane brought him to a deserted part of the abandoned lands, but he and Shane were both sure that there were not many ways to counter the poisonous air. Normal gas masks would start corroding, while the same would happen to other materials, and only living beings wouldn't have to face the same issue. Jason's skin wouldn't start corroding just like that, but he would start feeling a burning sensation spreading through his whole body before the poison would slowly start paralyzing his organs until they would start malfunctioning. After that, Jason would die slowly, fully aware of what was happening to him. Fortunately, however, he had the black origin flame. After testing that everything worked according to his expectations several weeks ago, with Shane next to him, he could finally enter the abandoned lands alone. Turning around, he could see Artemis, in her large form, flying through the air, while Scorpio followed him with loud noises. Both shared their excitement with Jason through their fortified soul conjunction, and he couldn't help but smile when he sensed that. It was already evening and there was not much light left to brighten the surroundings, so Jason decided to look out for a better place to construct a small resting place with a tent and a campfire. Meanwhile, Scorpio and Artemis could do whatever they wanted as long as they didn't run too far away to help Jason. A strong beast was to attack him, which he couldn't handle alone. Right now, they were inside a territory which released mana fluctuations, turning it in a wild zone between 3 and 4 stars, which told Jason that only evolved and unblemished ranked beasts should inhabit this area. However, this didn't mean that there might not be wild, awakened or even magical ranked beasts, because there was nobody controlling the abandoned lands as it was the case around cities. It was extremely important to control the surrounding wild zones from cities to repress strong beasts that might turn into a threat, while nobody cared about what happened inside the abandoned lands. There might be a few mercenaries hired every now and then to take a look at the strongest beasts around there, but that was already the most one would do. Jason was unsure if that was the best way to ensure Terebrian's safety, because the same tactic didn't seem to work on Asterix, as the Goblin King was able to build a large base without anyone knowing until the number of accidents with goblins reached a certain threshold. As such, it was crystal clear to Jason that a few mercenaries every now and then was not the best strategy to take care of threats in unsafe areas. But who was he to complain about it? In the end, this strategy would most likely be the reason for many casualties if there were to be a beast outbreak in the future, but also cost a huge fortune that could have been prevented with hunting units inside the abandoned lands or other areas. Nevertheless, Jason couldn't even say for sure that there was something extremely dangerous in the abandoned lands, and interpreting too much into nothing serious was not something he would do needlessly. After he found a great spot to construct his tent with few beasts around, which he saw thanks to his mana eyes, he halted in his steps and showed both Artemis and Scorpio where he would stay for the time being. Transmitting to him that they understood him, Jason finished building the tent and making a small campfire within 10 minutes. Sitting on a mattress he took out of his spatial ring, he started to wonder if there might be some treasures in the abandoned lands that would be worth enough to venture through them. However, after thinking about it for some time, the natural poisonous mana shouldn't be able to create any treasures, other than poison transmuted mana treasures. They might be helpful for Scorpio, but his soul bond was not even allowed to become much stronger than it currently was because of his feeble vessel, which couldn't even take 2 soul bonds and a small baptism. Sighing deeply, Jason was sure that he had more than enough to do during the next 2 days, in which Scorpio and Artemis would start to increase their combat experience to become proper peak unblemished beasts. If that was everything, they could have also gone to a nearby 3-star wild zone only to change to a 4-star wild zone later on, once his 2 soul bonds got the hang on the current combat prowess and what flaws they should fix first. The most apparent reason for him to enter the abandoned lands was to become stronger while fighting next to his soul bonds, or having one inside his mana core to fight with his other soul bond next to him. Not only did his soul bonds never fight next to each other or even alone for much, but Jason also understood that he had to build up greater teamwork while fighting with his soul bonds against other beasts, and also with one soul bond inside his mana core. There were only a few instances he was able to use his fortified soul conjunction truly. Even if he could manifest his soul bond's body parts inside the B-grade city they were currently living in, as long as he wore a mask or other means to disguise himself, it was still different from being able to go all out while fighting. Inside the 4-star rift, Scorpio's exoskeleton protected him from greater harm and probably from dying, while his stinger helped him out to defeat Greg in the Big 3 tournament. However, he never really tried to attack with his dagger and the stinger at the same time. There were so many tactics he wanted to test, and the most important thing Jason wanted to try was flying through the air and fighting a flying beast up there. The latter might require some time, but it was important for him to become proficient in every expertise, otherwise, he and his soul bonds might die in the future only because of such a mistake. Chapter 313 Reckless by Hydesgrain. He had slightly more than 2 days before Shane would bring him back, because he had to take care of the Golden Soul shop before everything would become much smoother, allowing him to leave the shop to his employees. As such, Jason decided that it would be best if he were to stay awake until Monday. Considering that his mana core size was already at the master rank, this was nothing special, and Jason was even confident in staying awake for more than a week without feeling tired at all. With that in mind, he took out a large basin, filled it with water before he heated it up by utilizing his fire affinity. After that was done, a few mana stones and a purple glowing medical solution manifested in his hands. Covering the area around the basin with mana stones and dissolving the medical solution, Jason was ready to practice the Netherworld's Fort body refining technique for the next few hours before he would start absorbing mana until it was morning. He was able to see almost everything through his mana eyes. However, since he encountered the Manellis poisonous fog and the untraceable drakes, Jason was more reluctant in relying on his mana eyes alone. As such, he didn't want to risk his life without reason, and instead Jason became slightly more careful. This was mainly thanks to the various experiences he encountered inside the 4-star rift. If he was able to turn back time and be able to decide once again whether or not he would venture inside the 4-star rift, Jason couldn't say for sure what he would pick right now. The experiences he gathered inside the rift were at least equally important to the pain he had to bear. Being betrayed and seeing that there were still proper humans that cared about each other was also something he never wanted to forget, because this was one reason for Jason to still hold hope for humanity. If he had not encountered the small group of kind humans inside the elemental crystal cave which tried to rescue their comrades from Lux and his undead soulbonds, Jason would have only bad memories about mankind. The Jewel and Drake clan couldn't be considered role models, and Jason never encountered anyone else from the Jewire or Grail except Seren and Till. Thus, he couldn't really tell how everyone treated their citizens. With this thought in mind, Jason decided that his experience inside the rift was important, which he couldn't just forget. Exerting the Netherworld's Fort technique, the black origin flame manifested within Jason to spread through his whole body while keeping a low temperature. Over the last several months since he started to practice the Netherworld's Fort technique, this step was always the same and didn't change much within his body anymore. However, the area where he established his body refining foundation by destroying, renewing, and recuperating his cells with the help of the Netherworld's Fort technique, was slowly being refined and expanding. Jason was still in the initial phase of the body refining technique, but the small refined area was slowly growing, demanding more mana and nutrition from him to accelerate the whole process, allowing him to become stronger. When he sensed that his body could take more nutrition and mana to refine his physique, Jason couldn't be happier. Refining his body would refine and also enlarge his vessel by a small margin, allowing his soul bonds to reach the peak of the unblemished rank without any worry. Since Artemis and Scorpio found out that Jason was in danger because of them, they tried their best to restrain themselves to become stronger, even if it was only a minuscule amount, in fear that it might hurt Jason. However, now that his body refining would accelerate, his two soul bonds could become stronger without many hindrances, as long as they didn't compress their mana to form mana drops in order to enter the magical rank. If that were to happen right now, there were several possible outcomes, and him writhing in unbearable pain was probably one of the better ones. Artemis and Scorpio knew that they shouldn't break into the magical rank. They would absorb more mana to smoothly enter the magical rank, once Jason was confident in taking their increased strength head-on. After he finished his body refining, Jason also practiced the Heaven's Hell technique before he started to absorb the mana from his surroundings with a few additional mana stones around him to further accelerate his mana absorption speed. When it was morning, Jason stretched his body, before he cleaned his tent. Washing up and changing into a clean set of clothes, he waited for his soul bonds to return from their hunting trip as Artemis transmitted Jason the way to their current position. Initially, he wanted that his soul bonds come to him, but after he used his fortified soul conjunction to see through Artemis' eyes, he could only deeply before storing everything in his spatial ring to depart. Exerting the weightless steps technique at the perfect mastery, Jason's speed increased by 60%, allowing him to arrive in front of his two soul bonds only slightly more than 15 minutes later. Scorpio's exoskeleton was filled with bumps and blood leaked from several injuries, while Artemis' pure white plumage was dirtied. She sustained injuries too. They were lighter, but what confused Jason the most was that even her pitch-black horns had blood on them. "What did you two do? It's not bad to be confident, but wasn't that a little bit much?" he just blurted out, when he saw that the plain in front of him was littered with beast corpses. From their incomplete mana core, Jason could tell that they were low unblemished ranked beasts with a few evolved ranked beasts among them. However, they seemed to belong to one single race, which told Jason that they were one large group which his two soul bonds ambushed. Did I teach them how to be so reckless? Jason couldn't help but ask himself as he took a look around. From the destroyed landscape around him, he could also tell that Artemis went rampage with her ice affinity, obstructing the majority of beasts to approach Scorpio. Meanwhile, Scorpio seemed to have picked out one corpse after another to sting them with his poisonous stinger, which he turned more lethal by adding his poison affinity. Furthermore, he also halved several beasts with his razor-sharp claws, turning the whole battlefield into a poodle of blood with spilled organs. Sighing deeply, Jason could tell that they tried to coordinate their attacks, but in the end, it didn't seem to have worked out as they wanted. At least that was what Jason figured out once he saw that Artemis was full of dirt with blood from one of the beasts on her horn, which probably happened when she had to rescue Scorpio from the low unblemished ranked beast stampede. Even then, Scorpio looked no better than the time Jason had to use its exoskeleton to protect himself from the explosion he forcefully created inside the 4-star rift to kill the wind crystal horned python. Comprehending what happened on the small battlefield in addition to his two soulbonds' memories which they reluctantly transmitted to him after he requested it, Jason finally knew where he had to start with his training. Coordination. Chapter 314 Coordination by Hydesgrain. Jason tried to think of ways to improve Artemis and Scorpio's coordination when he remembered how high the current combat prowess was. They're neither weak nor extremely strong among unblemished beasts, but they're trying to work together to fight against the large horde of beasts. Somehow it worked out. Their coordination, however, was still extremely bad, which he had to improve. Rather than that, it could be said that they would need to establish a better, synchronized coordination. It was fortunate for Jason that he has only two soulbonds right now, because it wouldn't be too much of a hassle to create an acceptable coordination between the both. If he were to add himself in this calculation, all three had to work together in order to prevent obstructing each other, survive at all costs, and become even stronger by fighting. As such, after storing away all corpses inside his spatial rings area for preserved goods. Once that was done, he ignored Artemis' demand to be washed. If they were to venture into a place that was even more dangerous than the abandoned lands, Artemis would have to be able to accept her dirty plumage. Otherwise, she might lower her guard when Jason washed her, while the same could happen to him. Furthermore, it would be weird to wash Artemis after every single small battle, considering that all of them would end as it happened in his soulbond's first skirmish. Walking through the plains, they encountered many different beast races, but almost all of them had either something to do with poison, whether it was that they innately had poison or a poison affinity. There were also other beasts, with all kinds of affinities. However, all of them had to have faint poison resistance. Other than that, there were also flying beasts that were unaffected by the poisonous soil and poisonous reeking stench radiating from it, until they had to land on the ground. While walking around, Jason started to experiment with his two soulbonds to figure out how long it would need for either of them to enter his mana core when they were summoned outside the soul world. After several tries, it was clear that Artemis required slightly less time than Scorpio, which was probably thanks to her slightly thicker fortified soul conjunction, which allowed her to enter his soul world faster. This was interesting to know, but before he could continue with other experiments he was interested in, the three of them encountered a suitable group they could prey on. More than 100 meters away from them was a large group of rotten triceratops grazing innocently. Rotten triceratops were heavy and large four-legged beasts with a head that was shaped similar to a shield, protecting them from most frontal attacks. 3 horns protruded out of their head, with one small, yet razor-sharp one above its nose, while 2 long horns erected above its eyes. From Jason's knowledge, Triceratops were already an ancient beast race that lived a long time ago on Argos, only to return when rifts opened which revived many extinct races. However, even if some fanatics were happy about this outcome, Jason didn't really care. He could only acknowledge that these Triceratopses looked great if they were not rotting right now, as they missed large chunks of flesh in some areas, revealing their rib cages and large bones. Jason wanted to try out something new, which led him to instruct his soul bonds to enter the soul world before Artemis entered his mana core to manifest her wings. With large wings manifesting behind him, he ascended more than 100 meters into the air before he carefully approached the rotten Triceratopses, not without neglecting to look if something were to surprise attack him from behind. Fortunately, nothing like that seemed to happen, and the Triceratops were still grazing, indicating that they had neither heard nor seen him. Once he was above them, Jason dived down towards them, with Artemis wings pressed on his shoulder blades, only to open them when he was barely 10 meters above the ground. Through his acceleration, he was forced to descend further, and he reached the height of 5 meters when he was able to slow down slightly. Summoning the new weapon he forged not long ago into his hand, Scorpio emerged in the air next to him, only to crash into the ground, barely 2 meters away from the closest rotten Triceratops, which noticed its danger slightly too late. Scorpio pierced out with its stinger while at the same time using its claws to inflict cuts in his opponent's thick hide. Meanwhile, Jason dissolved Artemis' wings, allowing her to leave the mana core as she emerged next to him, while he fell down to the ground. With his newly forged light longsword in hand, Jason injected mana into it before enveloping it with black, violent flickering flames. Slashing out at the first rotten Triceratops, he immediately noticed that its horns were extremely durable, and they seemed to be even harder than his mana grade 1 longsword. This caused Jason to smile as he exerted the weightless steps technique with its perfect mastery fully, to increase his speed by 60%. Leaning forward, Jason tried to rush past the rotten Triceratops, only to notice that he was still slower than it, which caused him to frown. Forced to retreat because the Triceratops thrust its horns towards him, Jason had to think of a different way to approach his opponent that was only a low unblemished beast. Using his ice affinity to erect a small wall in front of him to distract the rotten Triceratops, Jason created small cracks below him in the soil when he pushed his feet from the ground to speed up in order to leave his current position. While the rotten Triceratops couldn't see him, it didn't remain idle and charged towards the ice wall, which it shattered without much resistance, only to see Jason from the corner of its eye, slashing at it with a faint smile on his face. Most beasts would never think that anybody would stealthily attack or even use tricks to defeat their opponent, because they wouldn't do that either. However, this was mostly because of these beasts' intelligence that was still lower than humans, and their instinctive way to fight against others head-on without trying to think of a better way to fight. According to his masters, there were not many beasts that tried to use tricks to defeat their opponents. Rather than that, they would die while fighting or try to flee from someone who was noticeably stronger than themselves. There were a few beasts that were intelligent enough to fight head-on and use tricks at the same time, while it was even possible for intelligent beasts to coordinate lower-ranked beasts with their wisdom. Something similar to that was the reason for the goblins to gather under a higher-ranked, evolved being like the Goblin King that was stronger and more intelligent than them. However, the rotten Triceratops neither had a leader to instruct them nor a high intelligence to figure out if someone was scheming or trying to do something else. This was also the reason for Jason's small ice wall trick to work out better than he initially expected, as the rotten Triceratops' side was now open, completely unguarded, as he slashed out with his mana-injected longsword that was still enveloped with his black origin flames. Black Flames. Chapter 315, Visualizing the Issue by Hydesgrain. Without much resistance, the black flames burned through the rotten Triceratops' thick hide, inflicting a serious injury. Smiling brightly, Jason used up more mana to unleash the black origin flame inside the rotten Triceratops' body, which cried out in pain when it noticed what was going on. The surrounding poisonous stench overlapped with the burning fragrance, and the remaining Triceratopses averted their attention to Jason and the dying brethren as they roared out in anger. They were about to charge to Jason when they noticed that it was not possible because they themselves were struggling to stay alive. Artemis and Scorpio's attacks were much stronger than Jason's, who could only fight against mid-unblemished ranked beasts at most, with the help of his affinities. His physique was only refined by a small degree while his mana core size reached that of an average second master rank. However, unfortunately, beasts were still innately stronger. This made it much more difficult for Jason to fight against unblemished beasts because they were not only physically stronger but also more durable and faster than him. It was not a huge difference, making it impossible for him to overcome, but Jason was already struggling to fight against a single rotten Triceratops, while Artemis and Scorpio were facing multiple at once. However, their physical strength was superior to the rotten Triceratops, allowing Scorpio to slaughter his ways through his opponents, while Artemis flew across the battlefield, shooting out several dozen compressed ice shards almost every second without pausing. Artemis targeted the rotten Triceratops' vital spots while Scorpio killed everything, seemingly without any effort. Even if the other Triceratops wanted to rescue their brethren that were dying under unbearable pain, caused by the black origin flame within it, they were unable to do so. After Jason's opponent has been burned from the inside, it collapsed lifelessly on the ground. Turning around, Jason could observe the whole fight, if one were to call it like that, much better. He knew that he much was weaker than his soul bonds, but his combat experience was higher than theirs, yet, more oriented in fighting against other humans than beasts. The last time he fought other beasts were goblins several months ago, if one were to disregard everything that happened inside the 4-star rift where he was running away and not fighting against anything. Nevertheless, he saw many beasts fighting against each other inside the 4-star rift, which allowed him to see different combat styles from the beast races. They were mostly focused on their instincts, and Jason wanted to use this knowledge to help his soul bonds to use their instincts and at the same time their intelligence to increase their combat prowess manifold. He continued to observe his soul bonds' behavior during the fight, how they acted under pressure, get to know their attack patterns, and see if they utilized everything they could or if held back their strength needlessly. The whole battle ended 10 minutes later, and Scorpio received a few more dents in its exoskeleton while its stinger has been pierced by one of the rotten Triceratops' extremely hard horns, causing it to bleed, while Artemis was exhausted after using up all her mana to weaken all opponents. She didn't attack them directly in a close combat fight, but rather focused on her affinity and how she could support Scorpio in defeating the Triceratopses. Furthermore, she was also worried about Jason and how he was doing, only to see that he observed their fight after he finished his sole opponent, which caused her to work much harder. Now that both were exhausted, Jason approached them, sighing as he said, "That should have been much better than your last fight, but what would happen if another beast group were to be attracted by the loud noises? Could both of you continue to fight with your current condition?" They couldn't understand the human language, yet, but through their soul connection, they perfectly understood everything Jason said. However, instead of receiving several praises like they expected, they were lectured, which caused both Artemis and Scorpio to feel downhearted. Nevertheless, they noticed that Jason wasn't mad or anything like that, and that he wanted to help them. At least that was what they sensed through their connection with him. Unfortunately, they couldn't directly comprehend what Jason meant with his words, which led Jason to transmit 3 pictures he visualized to them. One picture was their current, exhausted, and injured appearance, while the second was a visualization of more than 100 unblemished beasts attacking them. The third picture showed the result of Artemis and Scorpio fighting against the second beast horde, which was their possible death in a life-threatening fight. Even if the rotten Triceratopses had an extremely sturdy skull with razor-sharp horns that could even pierce through weak protected areas of peak unblemished beasts, in the end, they were only low unblemished ranked beasts. With that in mind, Artemis shouldn't have to use up her whole stored mana, and Scorpio's injuries should be fewer. Through Scorpio's current condition, with his stinger pierced through, his combat prowess would decrease by a large degree, making the next fights even more difficult. Understanding this after clarifying everything through more visualized images, Jason's soul bonds finally knew what exactly he was trying to tell them. They began to comprehend what exactly they had to focus on too. Fighting efficiently without sustaining a single injury. When he saw this, Jason couldn't help but smile, and he took out recuperation potions which he poured into Artemis and Scorpio's mouth. Feeling that his soul bond's pain lessened after a few moments, he turned around to the battlefield to store away all rotten Triceratops corpses. Their rotten flesh might not be worth much, but their skull would only need small adjustments before one could sell them as shields. Furthermore, one could either cut their horns from the skull to grind a weapon out of it, or create a spiky shield that might even work as a means to attack. Other than that, one was able to create a sturdy leather armor with their hide, and Jason was sure that their bones and blood could be used to concoct some potions. As such, their body was valuable, and Jason wouldn't just walk away from the beast carcasses he and his soul bonds killed. If he killed something, he should at least use their body to earn something out of it. Otherwise, he would have killed without reason. Once he came back to Artemis and Scorpio, they looked much better, but instead of continuing their coordination training, Jason decided that it would be better to let both recuperate in his soul world for some time. Inside a soul world, a soul bond's recuperation would accelerate manifold, and an injury that would take several days to heal would be fine after a single day. Artemis was only exhausted and would be fine in less than an hour as long as she replenished her used-up mana, while Scorpio's exoskeleton would also be completely healed after 2 hours at most. However, his pierced-through stinger would probably require 1 day, which obstructed Jason's initial plan. After thinking about it, Jason thought that he could also consider this as an opportunity for Scorpio to use his other means to attack, because he hadn't seen him using his affinity or much mana during the whole skirmish against the large group of rotten Triceratops. With that in mind, he smiled slyly once both his soul bonds were inside his soul world to recuperate their condition to a certain degree before Jason would throw them out again. Chapter 316, Using All Means by Hydesgrain. After having seen Artemis and Scorpio's battle, Jason not only knew that their coordination was lacking, but also that they weren't fighting with all their might. It was not that they didn't fight half-heartedly, but they subconsciously held back by not using every they could. Scorpio only used his stinger and claws to fight against the rotten Triceratops, while he didn't utilize his affinity or even mana to enhance his body. Jason used his poison affinity more versatile than Scorpio, which shouldn't be the case. He was already able to manifest several different kinds of poisonous fogs, and even poisonous shards by enveloping any kind of poison desired into a layer of mana. It was much easier to do the same with a faint layer of ice surrounding the poison within, because one didn't have to continuously supply mana to a poison icicle as it was the case with a normal poisonous shard. However, it was still possible with enough effort, and Jason was sure that he could improve this type of attack more to reduce the mana consumption and increase the lethality further as long as he had time. Meanwhile, Artemis only utilized her affinity and didn't seem to bother about using her body to enter close combat as long as it was not necessary to survive. This meant that not only Scorpio held back while fighting, but also Artemis, whose blood was mana-infused, which allowed her to be slightly stronger than normal peak unblemished beasts under normal circumstances. With that in mind, Jason couldn't help but think that he had to force them to use everything in their means to fight against other beasts or even humans, which might happen in the future. He was not a fan of this thought, but it would happen sooner or later. As such, he had to be prepared for everything, which included improving his soul bond's combat strength. Searching for a good place to rest, Jason passively absorbing mana while he observed everything with his mana eyes. Additionally, he looked around if there was anything around that didn't release any mana, which would also be counted as a threat by him before he knew what exactly it was that he couldn't detect through his mana eyes. Since he encountered manaless poison and even a beast he couldn't detect with his mana eyes, Jason started to act more careful with his mana eyes. He didn't trust them completely anymore. This was unfortunate but definitely a necessary step to stay alive after he noticed how much he relied on them. He could only say that if it was fortunate for him to notice this early enough, otherwise, he might already be dead by now. Only half an hour passed before Artemis emerged out of the pure white mana circle that manifested next to him. Adjusting her size, Artemis squeezed herself on Jason's shoulder, where she rubbed her dirty head at his. Caressing her while continuing to walk around, he noticed that her mana replenished extremely fast as her mana core was already filled by 3/4. Squeezed on his shoulder, she continued to absorb mana passively, which she already learned to do a while ago. It was nothing special for beasts that had the potential to reach the magical rank because absorbing mana from the surrounding was one of the requirements to maintain one's life as a magical ranked beast that required it, but Artemis was still somewhat unique in this field. Not only did she learn how to passively absorb mana shortly after she finished her evolution, but her conversion from natural mana to ice transmuted mana was extremely fast, which allowed her passive mana absorption to accelerate by a small margin. Scorpio was also able to passively absorb mana, but he only learned it several days before the departure to the abandoned lands. His passive mana absorption speed was also noticeably slower than Artemis because his conversion from natural mana to poison transmuted mana was also slower. This was also one of the reasons for Scorpio to pay more attention to his physical state instead of mana. His control was lower than Artemis, and he also knew that his racial limit was not far away for him to reach. When he first figured out that Artemis, his rival, had a higher potential than he had, Scorpio immediately complained with loud noises and a vulgar outbreak of words he didn't even knew the meaning about. At that time, Jason was sure that a fortified soul conjunction was not established to act like this with each other. However, it hurt him somehow to see how Scorpio felt, knowing that its potential was lower than Artemis, but that was not because of the apparent reason. Jason felt hurt because Scorpio didn't seem to appreciate how much effort and pain he and Dahlia had to endure to allow Scorpio to reach his current strength, and this thought hurt extremely. Somehow he felt the desire to tell everything, Dahlia, in order to share his pain, but Jason felt like his master would feel even more betrayed about that because she was so happy to see that Scorpio became stronger, considering that he started as a miniature Parascores. Scorpio was definitely greedy, but it couldn't be considered bad because one would think that it was a positive trait as long as one was ambitious enough to strive for more. However, unfortunately enough, Scorpio seemed to be in a slump at the moment, which was why Jason had to think of a way for it to leave this hellhole of a slump for good. Less than an hour later, he found the perfect place to initiate his plan, with several small beast groups, consisting of 3 to 7 beasts that were at the low unblemished rank in the surrounding area. Smiling lightly, Artemis on his shoulder noticed that something was off, which caused her to flee from Jason's grasp as she ascended into the air, where she remained, gazing at him with her ice blue eyes. Summoning Scorpio, whose stinger was still not fully healed, he transmitted his soul bonds his plan. Artemis, you are not allowed to use your affinity for long-range attacks. You have mana-infused blood and your talons are sharp enough to pierce through low unblemished ranked beast hide. Furthermore, you can use your affinity much more versatile. There is no need for you to attack with icicles all the same if you don't want to drain your mana every single fight. Scorpio, you are not allowed to rely on your physical strength alone. Your task is to constantly use your mana and affinity. It is good that you have great stamina and that you can fight other beasts head-on with your physical strength alone, but you have enough mana to prevent the injuries you sustained during the last 2 fights, and your poison affinity is also not only an accessory or something I use alone, but it's innately yours. You already saw how I used the poison affinity, and I doubt that your proficiency should be worse. When he finished with his instructions, Jason could only hear reluctant and frustrated screeches from Artemis and Scorpio directly transmitted into his mind. However, Jason just ignored their pleading and shouted, "Go, go! which was heard by the closest, small beast group that turned towards them with bloodshot eyes before they charged towards the three of them. Chapter 317 I've never seen her like that by Hydesgrain. Observing the battle of Artemis and Scorpio against the small group of low unblemished ranked elemental lions, Jason could tell that his previous instructions were harsh but definitely helpful. While Scorpio was struggling to use his mana and poison affinity in his fight except relying on his high physical strength, Artemis continued to try using her ice affinity as much as possible, even in close combat. However, she also used her claws, beak, and horns to fights, which Jason noticed with a satisfied nod. In the end, both were struggling to change their combat style, but it was much better than Jason expected. As such, he couldn't help but smile at his soulbonds, whose attitude changed after they noticed how narrow-minded the previous combat style was. It was much easier to defeat their opponents after getting the hang of it. Once the first group of elemental lions was taken care of without anyone sustaining any serious injuries, Artemis and Scorpio were told to continue with their training under the same conditions as before, which they did without any hesitation. It was already Sunday evening when Jason ended the short 2-day training trip to the Abandoned Lands. Artemis and Scorpio's combat experience heightened and both changed their combat style drastically compared to Saturday morning, where they were still stuck in common fighting patterns. Nevertheless, Jason knew that they still required a lot more practice and he would have to come to the Abandoned Lands or similar training grounds once he had free time. With that in mind, he tried to figure out what else he could teach them in order to increase their combat prowess. Unfortunately, there was not too much because he was not a beast and couldn't understand Artemis or Scorpio's wild instincts at all. Adding the fact that he himself was not overly proficient in fighting beasts, Jason could only hint at the most obvious flaws he noticed by observing them intently. Other than that, Jason told them to figure out the greatest weakness alone and to work on them once they were back at his master's backyard or outside the dome, where they wouldn't destroy anything valuable. Walking around the Abandoned Lands, waiting for Shane to pick him up again, Jason pondered about something else he noticed. His mana core size was already comparable to that of an average second master, which was one whole rank above his mana core rank that was at the second expert rank. This would have been advantageous in many cases, but he wanted to break through at a fast pace over the next few months, which was hardly possible if he had to fill his expert rank mana core with the amount an average second master rank would normally require to break through. Right now, his mana core was 20% refined and Jason noticed that he would still need 3 weeks to enter the third expert rank. Under normal circumstances, such a feat was already considered good because someone with an average mana aptitude would need much longer than 10 years to enter the master rank after entering the expert rank. Even someone with an above average mana aptitude would need 10 years, while humans with a great mana aptitude required around 3 to 5 years. For example, Malia Flay broke into the master stage when she turned 16 years old. She began to sense mana at the age of 8 years and didn't need a long time to enter the adept rank at the age of 10. Slowly adjusting to the sensation of mana, she required 3 years to enter the expert rank, only for her to need 3 more years to enter the master rank. Under normal circumstances, Malia wouldn't have needed 3 years to enter the master rank, but her mana mastery was still increasing in her puberty, which increased her mana absorption by a large margin. However, she also contracted 2 soul bonds in quick succession. Through the soul world amplification Malia received at the age of 14, she had to fill up a mana core that was larger in size than her current rank. At the time she contracted her first soul bond, she was at the 4th expert rank, which caused her breakthrough speed to slow down. However, she didn't mind that and continued as if nothing happened, which was probably the best mindset one could have towards absorbing mana. Jason was similar, yet different. His mana core size increased by a whole rank, and every time he could break through, someone else with the same mana attitude as him would be able to break through while being a whole stage above him. Nevertheless, Jason couldn't complain about his high soul world amplification because it rescued him many times and was one of the biggest reasons for him to reach his current strength. As such, he had to find a way to increase his absorption speed to enlarge his vessel, strengthen it, and keep up with his soul bond's increase of strength to not fall behind too much. Not long after Jason finished his train of thoughts, space twisted nearby him and Shane emerged out of it. Grinning foolishly, Jason said teasingly, "You're finally here, Master." Frowning at Jason's words, Shane answered, his mood visibly bad. "I can also go if you don't want to be brought back." "No. No." Jason hurriedly said before Scorpio disappeared inside the magic circle below him to appear in his soul world. Artemis shrunk in size and landed on Jason's shoulder, and everyone was ready to depart, while Jason only hoped that his master wouldn't hold a grudge against him because he only wanted to tease him a little bit. Suddenly he remembered that Emily was probably still at their house, which caused mixed emotions to emerge within him as he asked, "What happened to Emily? Does Dahlia still want to take her in?" Sighing deeply, Shane could only shrug his shoulders. "It's extremely weird. Let's go back and you can take a look for yourself." This didn't sound really good to Jason, but he only nodded his head before they walked through the spatial portal Shane manifested to appear inside their house. Looking around, there didn't seem to be any changes when Shane said, "Just follow the noises." Only now did he hear two feminine voices having a dispute about something, which caused Jason to frown when he followed his master's advice. Following the noises, he arrived in front of the room that was directly next to his. Knocking at the door, the voices within immediately quieted down. Noticing this, Jason only said, "I'm coming inside," before he opened the door. "No," was the only thing Jason heard when he saw Dahlia trying to force a bunch of dresses on Emily, who stood only a few meters away from Jason. Emily was only wearing a skirt and a thin white blouse, which she tried to take off when she noticed Jason standing in the doorframe. Closing the door almost immediately, he turned around where he saw Shane throwing a sly smile at him. "You already knew that this would happen, right?" Jason asked, trying to remain level-headed while cursing his master from within. However, instead of answering his question, Shane just shrugged his shoulder before he seriously said, "Dahlia's behavior is still weird. I've never seen her like that." Chapter 318 I Don't Want to Be a Burden by Hydesgrain. Suddenly, Shane started to list complaints about the last 2 days, with the most important one that Dahlia began to ignore him because she focused more on Emily, who she spoiled like a small princess. Not only did she receive several dresses, but also more than 100 new sets of clothes, which caused Jason to look at Shane with widened eyes. "I have less than 10 sets of clothes," he mumbled, not knowing why someone should need 100 sets of clothes. Sighing deeply, Jason continued to listen to Shane's complaints, which didn't seem to stop anytime soon, when he heard, "Dahlia trusts her too much and unconditionally at that. We don't even know if everything Emily said is true. I told Dahlia that we should make a soul contract with Emily which prevents her from temporarily lying to anyone, but Dahlia almost threw me out of the house. Can you believe that?" Suddenly the door behind Jason was ripped open when he turned around to see Dahlia glaring daggers at him. "Why didn't you wait for someone to open the door? Did you never learn to be considerate?" She was almost shouting, and Jason could almost immediately tell that Dahlia was different compared to before. However, in his opinion, this didn't allow her to act like she was currently doing. "I knocked and nobody answered. As such, I just opened the door. It's not like you could have said, 'Wait a moment.' That's not too much to ask for, right?" Halting in her tracks, Dahlia didn't know what to answer, and she had to acknowledge her disciple's words. Still, she couldn't just accept it, that Jason saw something he shouldn't have. Behind Dahlia, Emily, who had a completely red head, appeared, wearing all of her clothes again, looking at Jason for a moment before she averted her gaze. Tucking at Dahlia's robe, she faintly said, It was my fault and not Jason's. Turning around to Emily, Dahlia smiled gently as Jason suddenly asked, "Is Emily now officially living here?" Dahlia didn't even answer directly and only nodded her head, which caused him to frown. "If that's the case, shouldn't we at least form a soul contract that prevents lying for the next few hours to ask her questions? Why haven't you done so until now? Isn't it too dangerous to let a stranger live with us?" Looking at Emily, he just said, "I hope you understand that and won't take it offensive. It would be weirder to trust someone without knowing him or her before, right?" Emily just nodded her head and was about to say that she could sign a soul contract to show her innocence, when Dahlia, next to her, erupted. "We didn't force you to sign a soul contract to figure more about you either. What you are doing is almost abuse." When Dahlia said this, Jason couldn't help but glance at Shane, who only shrugged his shoulders, not knowing what happened to his wife who behaved like a hypocrite. Jason felt weird that his master behaved like this and he sized her up with his mana eyes, only to see that nothing was amiss. Did something happen to her head? He suddenly began to thought, but only her behavior changed and nothing else, so it shouldn't be something major. At least that was what both Jason and Shane thought when they glanced at Dahlia in confusion. Trying to remain calm, Jason said, "I was not asked to sign a soul contract to answer honestly because you two already knew everything. But I don't really think that's something surprising after the two of you stalked me for several months, right? I doubt that you know much about Emily and neither do you know if everything is true. Furthermore, we are currently in a completely different situation than before, or am I wrong?" Looking at Emily with a faint smile, he apologized, "Again, that's nothing against you, Shane, and I just don't know you good enough to think that it would be a great idea to let you live here without knowing anything about you." Emily could understand Jason's reasoning fully and she would probably be reluctant to let a stranger live in her house too. Even more so after the things she heard during the discussion, which sound like she unintentionally entered a lion den. However, to her, it was more important that Jason rescued her from being enslaved while Dahlia was extremely kind to her without demanding anything in return. She didn't mind living somewhere dangerous as long as she could be helpful to those who helped her. Additionally, Shane didn't seem to be a bad person, even if he looked at her suspiciously, which was, however, not surprising. At least if one considered how much of a coincidence everything was and how much Dahlia seemed to have changed because of Emily's sudden appearance. Dahlia was about to retort Jason's words when Emily next to her said, "I'll sign a soul contract, preventing me from lying to any of you temporarily or even permanently. Furthermore, if it's required, I can even sign a non-disclosure agreement to avoid accidentally revealing something important to others. I know that I'm a hassle, and if that is not enough, I can also leave the house and be a normal employee at the Golden Soul Shop, if necessary." When she finished her words, Emily's expression turned sad and even Shane couldn't help but feel pity for her. Nobody knew how hard her life in the orphanage was, but seeing how considerate she was, Jason and Shane couldn't help but rethink their suspicion. Emily didn't want to become a burden to someone and was happy to be accepted into someone's house, and they didn't even demand anything grand in return. She could also understand Shane and Jason's suspicion, and rather than thinking that this was weird, Dahlia's excessive kindness and how she was treated by her was weirder, even if it didn't make her feel uncomfortable. Shane cleared his throat and said, "You don't have to leave if everything with the temporary soul contract goes well. Just keep in mind that it might be dangerous to stay with us. I can tell that you already understand that we are different from others, but keep in mind that slave merchants are not the biggest problem you have to face as long as you stay next to us." He was still uncomfortable with his wife's behavior, but Shane also knew that Dahlia wanted to have a child for centuries, a girl at that. As such, he thought that she might want Emily to become her daughter. This thought lingered in Shane's head for 2 days when Dahlia accepted Emily just like that into the house without taking any precautions. Maybe the last 50 years in isolation were too much for her. Even if it might turn into a mistake to accept Emily into our house or family just like that, forcing her to leave would only worsen Dahlia's mood or maybe even make her depressed, right? Shane didn't really care much about Emily if he were to be honest, and he only wanted Dahlia and Jason to be as safe as possible. In that case, Emily was an irregular factor that might endanger their safety, which caused Shane to doubt everything about her since Jason brought her inside. However, seeing how happy Dahlia was, felt good and bad at the same time because he couldn't ask Emily to leave the house anymore. If I pay enough attention to her, everything should be fine, even if she has an ulterior intention. I guess Shane told himself when he saw Jason adding 2 new clauses to his already existing soul contract with Emily. Chapter 319 Advertisement by Hydesgrain. The clauses Jason added to the soul contract which he had already formed with Emily were that she was neither allowed to lie to him nor to his masters when they demanded to know the truth about something. Furthermore, he also added a non-disclosure clause preventing Emily from accidentally revealing any secrets she will get to know while staying with them. This also included that she shouldn't talk about anything that might make Jason and his masters look like they were suspicious. Emily was fine with the new contract and accepted it without any hesitation, while Dahlia seemed to feel a little bit vexed. Jason tried to ignore this and eyed his master weirdly, asking himself if she was desperate to have another female in the house because he and Shane were too frustrating or if it was because of something else. How should he have known that Dahlia felt an innate connection to Emily which even she herself couldn't understand? When Jason carried her inside the house, Dahlia was not excessively interested in her. She only wanted to tend her wounds and nothing else. But after some time after she got to know what happened to Emily and how she escaped, that she was an orphan for almost all her life and Dahlia couldn't help but size her up again at that time. After that, everything was over and she subconsciously decided that she would take in Emily, even if Shane or Jason were to disagree. In the end, both Shane and Jason seemed to accept her easier than Dahlia expected, and the only issue she had was their suspicion about her, which was why they demanded a soul contract to prevent her from revealing any secrets or that she could even lie to them if they were to demand to know the truth about something. However, after thinking about it for a moment, Dahlia couldn't help but think that the two were not entirely wrong. She figured out that acting too rash and thoughtless was not the best solution because of their particular situation, and it was obvious that nobody knew who exactly Emily was and if her story was the entire truth. Now that everything was finished, Jason stepped back, allowing Shane to ask Emily the questions he had in mind to determine if she was trustworthy and loyal or not. Jason had something else to take care of for now and left the other 3. He entered his room, where he opened the holographic screen of his quantum bracelet. Jason received several messages from various people that want to become employees from the Golden Soul Shop, which was what he hoped for. After reading through all messages he received, there were only a few he was truly interested in because most answers to his request were only, "Hello Mr. Lara, I want to become your employee. Let me work hard and earn you a huge fortune." The meaning of such an answer was obvious, which was that they wanted to please him and nothing else. On one side, someone with such an attitude was in most cases easier to handle than uncommunicative people. However, there were still messages Jason liked more because they were either extremely confident in themselves or overestimated the capabilities, which was hilarious to read. One example for such a message was from a young man, at least that was what Jason assumed after seeing his profile picture, who wrote, "Mr. Lara, I would like to become a useful asset to the Golden Soul Shop, but I won't sign a soul contract with such a low salary. I know my worth and I won't accept being restricted with that kind of salary." Either the young man called Silas Lower was too full of himself or he was the perfect candidate for his shop because he wanted confident employees who could throw out wicked customers. Right now, it was already Sunday, late in the evening, but Jason still messaged the young man what exactly he expected to receive as salary, and how exactly he was worth that amount. Once he sent a message to Silas Lower, Jason switched to another website that was used to advertise shops before starting to write an application. In the beginning, it would be difficult to get any customers, and he was fully aware of that. However, once the first few customers arrived, the Golden Soul shop with its high-purity goods would start attracting a larger mass. For this, he would only need to get a few customers first, which was why he paid 1 million credits to be advertised through the whole B-grade city for 3 days straight. If he were to advertise his shop more, it might be too much, and the other shops inside the B-grade city might turn against him, which was not something he wanted. Furthermore, he had only a limited amount of goods for now because he could neither mass-produce anything yet, nor did he have any extremely unique weapons or other forged goods. Jason had several hundred perfectly purified bars made out of jade iron, other grade 1 ores, and even a few grade 2 ores that were slightly easier to purify than normal grade 2 ores. Furthermore, he was confident in mass-producing potions soon, to provide more, even if he already had quite a large stockpile of potions. The only good he was truly lacking right now were forged weapons, because it required the most time to forge them. While waiting to receive an answer from Silas Lower, who was the only applicant he found truly interesting, Jason decided to practice the Heaven's Hell technique to increase his amount of soul energy units. Once he was done, it was already midnight, when he received a notification, which caused him to chuckle lightly. How about 30,000 credits? For that sum, I would also sign a soul contract. 30,000 credits. It's not like that is a great sum, considering that I can hunt it in less than an hour through a single unblemished ranked beast. If he's worth that sum, why not? After getting to know that most humans were either too frightened or weak-willed to fight against beasts, Jason began to understand the worth of hunters and how rich they were compared to normal citizens. For Jason, 30,000 credits a month was nothing, but for others, it was enough to live luxurious for several months or even half a year. Thinking about credits, he remembered that he had several hundred unblemished ranked beast corpses in his spatial ring, with many of them having rare materials. Thus, he wouldn't have a shortage of money to pay his employees, which allowed him to pay them more than he initially planned as long as they worked hard. Furthermore, he would have to take care of Emily if his masters would make him responsible for her, which was something he didn't want to happen. Jason hoped that this would not be the case, but he had a premonition about it and could only hope that he was wrong. After messaging Silas Lower that he was fine with giving him such a high salary if he worked hard enough in addition to the time and place he should arrive the next day, Jason washed up and went into his bed, where Scorpio was already laying with half its body and Artemis immediately next to it. Sighing deeply, Jason began to wonder why exactly his soul bonds were too clingy and indigent compared to every single other soul bond he got to know over the last few months. Is that because of me or only their normal behavior? He asked himself, but it was not like he would receive an answer to that. Laying down in his bed, he didn't need much time to fall into a deep dreamless slumber. Chapter 320 Golden by Hydesgrain. It was barely 5 a.m. when Jason woke up. Stretching his body, he rubbed his drowsy eye only to see that both Artemis and Scorpio were still sleeping. Smiling at him, he got out of the bed quietly before he washed up and changed into a neat set of clothes. When he would enter the Golden Soul shop, Jason would wear a mask to retain his secret identity. This was not really necessary according to Shane and Dahlia, but his masters didn't take into consideration that he wouldn't be taken seriously as a youth, which Jason already figured out. Nobody would think that he was not even 15 years old because of his mature aura and looks. However, at the same time, nobody would believe that he was in his 20s either. As such, it was better to conceal his mana core and wear a mask inside his own shop, which would show everyone that he was either the heir from an influential family or a larger clan, trying to become independent. There were also several more assumptions others might take, but none of them would think that he was a young teenager without any real backing if one were to deduct his masters who shouldn't walk around, drawing attention to them. Otherwise, it might backlash, which was not something either of them wanted. After he was done, Jason walked down to the kitchen to eat something for breakfast, only to see that Emily was already there, cooking. Seeing that Jason was already awake, she smiled lightly, unsure how to behave with him. The atmosphere turned slightly awkward for Emily, who didn't know what to do as she saw that Jason took out a few dishes from his spatial ring, which caused her to exclaim, "No. Don't." Hearing this, Jason lifted his head in confusion to look at Emily, who was holding her hand out, trying to stop him from eating. "I'm cooking for everyone right now. Why don't you wait?" Lifting an eyebrow, Jason stood up to take a closer look to figure out what exactly Emily was cooking. It smelled delicious and he didn't have anything against eating it, but there was something that bothered Jason. "Emily, I don't know if you already know that, but what you're cooking is not even enough to satiate me, even less Shane or Dahlia, who should have an even higher demand for nutrition." "Well, that is at least if they don't supply it through something else. Furthermore, I'm not sure if you know that, but even if you live here now, the Golden Soul shop is about to open this morning and you're still considered my employee." Weakly nodding her head, Emily faintly asked, "Is that really not enough for everyone to be saturated? And of course, I know that I'm still your employee. When do you want to depart?" Emily's green eyes turned gloomy after Jason told her that the food she made was not enough, and Jason couldn't help but smile as he explained, "If you would cook with higher graded ingredients and not with unblemished ranked beast meat, it might be enough. I think I'll depart at 6 because I have to explain the other employee everything about the shop and sign the soul contract with him." Nodding her head, Emily still felt awkward with Jason, and even more so after she recalled that he saw her only wearing her underwear and a skirt the day before. Her cheeks turned red and she didn't know what to say when she heard him say, "How are you and your soul bond feeling? Did anything change or did nothing happen with the emerald green egg during the last 2 days?" Jason didn't really feel uncomfortable, but that was mostly because Shane reassured him that the story she told was the truth and that she doesn't have any ill intentions. Other than that, Jason could easily understand from the beginning who he was comfortable with and whom not because of the faint aura they released. He was not sure if everyone was the same in that, but he was always relatively good at detecting whom he could rely on and who he should stay away from. However, that was not something certain, which he only figured out after old Drake betrayed them. This was also the reason for him to be so adamant in asking Emily if she could sign a soul contract that prevented her betrayal and that she could lie to him and his masters. Her faint aura made it clear to Jason that she was someone kind and gentle, but being safe with a soul contract was still better. "Nothing special changed about the emerald green egg, except that I can barely feel something inside. I don't know why it is like that, but maybe the beast inside is only awakening or even being born after I contracted it. At least that was what Aunt Dahlia said, and Uncle Shane assumes the same." Aunt and uncle. I guess the current appearance is suitable to be called aunt and uncle. Chuckling lightly, Jason nodded his head before saying, "As long as everything is fine, it's good." Jason decided to not eat anything for now, and that it might be better to wait for Shane and Dahlia for now as he continued to talk with Emily. He still wanted to figure out how much she learned during the last 2 days and if she was ready to work inside the Golden Soul shop. Almost half an hour passed and Emily finished making breakfast when Shane and Dahlia entered the kitchen. "Oh. You two were already awake," Dahlia said with a bright smile, only for Jason to see a faint gleaming in her eyes, telling him that his masters already knew that he and Emily were here. "Let's eat. Jason has to take care of his shop from today onwards," Shane said before looking at Jason. Everyone nodded their head and the 4 of them set the table before they ate breakfast. Once Emily's dishes that were as tasty as they smelled were eaten up after a few minutes, Jason was forced to take out several more dishes which he ate, ignoring Dahlia, who glared daggers at him. She even mumbled that he was rude, only for Emily to hastily intervene. "Jason already explained to me that I should cook with higher grade ingredients if I want everyone to be saturated. If he is still hungry, he should eat more." Nodding his head, Jason just continued to eat, ignoring Dahlia, who was not satisfied with this result as he heard her grumbling. "I'll go and purchase better ingredients." Shane just shook his head and decided to ignore his wife too. Once Jason was done, he washed the dishes before entering his room where Artemis and Scorpio were still sleeping. Calling them back into his soul world, where they could continue to sleep, Jason walked outside again, before his shuttle arrived. As long as Artemis was sleeping, he couldn't call her into his mana core or manifest her wings, which was slightly annoying, but nothing he could change without waking her up. As such, he would rather call a shuttle and drive towards the Golden Soul shop. After he entered the shuttle, Jason noticed that Emily rushed behind him to enter the shuttle too, saying while gasping for air, "Don't forget your employee."